reach across time and see yourself. You stand tall against terrifying enemies. You build masterpieces and break down barriers. You rush into the future and meet your past. For every time, at every moment, the official network of every millennium. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
Behind these 36-foot-tall bronze doors at the National Archives, protected by a 14-foot spiked gate, stands a massive bronze and marble shrine. What's inside is shielded from ultraviolet light, protected by armed guards and bulletproof glass. It's a 200-year-old piece of parchment, one of America's most prized possessions. It is the Declaration of Independence. Hello, I'm Harry Smith. I'm standing in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where more than 200 years ago, delegates to the Second Continental Congress wrestled with the audacious idea of declaring independence from Britain. Their intentions and rationale fit on one piece of paper. Who knew a single document would change the world?
Washington, D.C., December 13th, 1952. A full-scale parade down Pennsylvania Avenue marked the transfer in an armored car of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights from the Library of Congress to the National Archives. Security was tight as the historic documents were enshrined in their new permanent home. Hermetically sealed to guard against the ravages of time, each of the priceless exhibits was placed in a display case that could be lowered at night into a specially constructed vault.
Cameras are no longer allowed inside the vault at the National Archives, but this model of the safe, complete with a miniature copy of the Declaration of Independence, is on display at the Ohio-based Mosler Safe Company. At the press of a button, 5-ton doors swing open. A scissors jack raises the documents, and 90 seconds later, they're ready for people to see. But surprisingly, what the National Archives is protecting is neither the original copy of the Declaration of Independence nor the oldest. On July 4th, when the Declaration of Independence was approved, the message needed to be spread quickly. So that day, a copy of the document was dropped off at the Philadelphia printing shop of John Dunlap, and his team of printers went to work.
A little bit of ink would have been taken out of the tray, worked around onto the surface of the leather, and then applied to the type. And there's one printed sheet.
They made about 150 of these Dunlap broadsides, as they're now called. They were printed on paper and had only 2 names at the bottom: John Hancock, the president of the Second Continental Congress, and Charles Thompson, its secretary. This Dunlap broadside at the Library of Congress used to belong to George Washington.
This document is only 3/4 here. The bottom fold has been broken off. Some say it's because Washington was so taken with the Declaration of Independence that he kept folding it and unfolding it until it broke.
The original document that was dropped off at Dunlap's shop has never been found. But today, 25 of the 150 Dunlap broadsides are known to exist. These are the oldest copies of the Declaration of Independence. But the Dunlap broadside is not what's encased at the National Archives. What is encased is this handwritten copy of the Declaration of Independence. Congress wanted an official version that its members could sign. So on July 19, 1776, it ordered that a copy be handwritten on parchment. On August 2nd, the delegates began to sign.
They knew this was a big moment. And so some people say Hancock announced, "I'm writing my name in large letters so that the king can see it without his spectacles." There was a kind of gesture there. There was a kind of flourish there. And a dare to everyone in the room, I think. Here, I've done it. Now it's your turn.
They were committing treason, rebelling against their mother country. But they signed anyway, in order of the geographic location of their colony. Delegates from New Hampshire went first, and those from Georgia last. Some of the delegates were absent on August 2nd and signed at a later date. One was Matthew Thornton of New Hampshire, who found that his fellow statesmen hadn't left any room for his name. He was relegated to the bottom right-hand corner, under the signatures from Connecticut. Two delegates never signed at all. One was Robert R. Livingston of New York, who left Philadelphia in mid-July. The other, John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, who argued to delay the call for independence. And then there were those who became new members of Congress later that year, but still signed.
It seems as delegates arrived through the fall, they would basically say, "Could I sign the Declaration of Independence?" And they went wherever it was kept in a drawer or something, pulled it out and said, "Sure." And then they signed it. So the 56 signatures that appear on the document weren't all present on one day.
By the fall of 1776, it seemed as if everyone wanted to sign, but it hadn't always been that way. Just a few years earlier, the colonists were happily loyal to the British Crown, and the idea of independence was the last thing on their minds. The relationship between Great Britain and the American colonies was pretty good in the mid-1700s. The colonists enjoyed the freedoms that came with being 3,000 miles away from the mother country, but knowing that if anything went wrong, she was there to help. It was a decent arrangement, and for over 150 years, it worked.
If you had taken an opinion poll in 1763, people's devotion to the king, their pride in being English, their delight in being part of the greatest empire in the world would have been off the charts.
Morale was high, especially since Great Britain had just defeated France in the French and Indian War, a drawn-out struggle in which the British won title to almost all of North America east of the Mississippi. But it was a costly win. By 1763, King George III and his ministers had to cover not only a massive war debt, but also the cost of keeping an army in their newly acquired American territory. So they did what any government would do: impose taxes. It sounds fair enough now, but in the 1760s, colonists just didn't see it that way, especially when taxes started showing up on everything from sugar, coffee, and tea to paint, paper, and lead.
The principal objection was that English people, wherever they were, according to long-developed theory, both in England and in the colonies, could not be taxed without their consent. And Americans argued very powerfully that they had no members in Parliament, they hadn't given their consent to these taxes, and therefore the taxes were illegal.
Angry colonists summed it up in 4 words: no taxation without representation. It was kind of catchy, so the call went out to the colonies. People threatened the king's tax officers and forced them to resign. They attacked their houses, dipped them in tar, and coated them with feathers. In large cities and small towns, from Boston to Savannah, people took to the streets in colorful demonstrations. In 1768, Parliament reacted to the colonial protest by sending British troops to Boston. Their job was to keep the peace, but altercations between townspeople and soldiers became more and more common, or at least it seemed that way, thanks to an outspoken Boston politician named Samuel Adams, a leader of the opposition to British policy.
Adams kept up a steady stream of reports to other colonies. If you believed every report that Adams sent out, every single woman in Boston was raped. Every single old person in the town had been beaten up by a soldier, and there is endless provocation. Adams advises people more or less to walk up to the bayonets and go like this and then go, police brutality, police brutality.
Resentment toward Great Britain was at an all-time high, and in March of 1770, the taunting escalated into a bloody confrontation on a Boston street.
Some soldiers and some civilians got into a shouting match. The civilians got, a lot of people came out in the streets. It got to be a rather large mob.
These soldiers were surrounded by mobs who put pieces of brick inside snowballs and were hurling them at the soldiers. It would be very difficult to decide who the aggressor was in this case. No one ever knew who shouted fire, and guns went off.
5 people lay dead. It became known as the Boston Massacre, thanks in part to Paul Revere, who made this engraving of the event.
It's one of the most effective pieces of propaganda that ever appeared in a newspaper. If you see this picture of the Boston Massacre, you absolutely believe that Attila the Hun has landed to, take your daughter away and kill your mother. And it is not what really happened. But it came down to Americans all over the colonies as an extraordinary piece of evidence that the King Parliament would turn on their own people and kill them.
To add insult to injury, Parliament approved the Tea Act in 1773 to help a British company sell surplus tea in the colonies. Unfortunately, the tea still carried an old tax.
Won't anybody have some more tea? Yes, thank you.
For 3 weeks, the English ships sat in the Boston harbor. Then, one night, angry townspeople dressed as Indians crept aboard and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. An act of rebellion that would become known as the Boston Tea Party.
This brought down the wrath of the British like nothing had, because this was the destruction of private property. So it wasn't so much a party as a major challenge to the English government, and it worked.
The New England government are in a state of rebellion, wrote King George III, and blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. The lines had been drawn. In April 1775, British troops began to move from Boston to the nearby community of Concord. Along the route in Lexington, an armed colonial militia was waiting for them. They say it was the shot heard round the world. No one knows who fired first, but the battles of Lexington and Concord had begun. News of the fighting spread through the land. In May, representatives from each colony met in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. There was great support for the people of Massachusetts, but no one was calling for independence just yet. Most colonists were far from comfortable with the idea, preferring instead to reconcile with the king.
The idea that because you were mad about policy, you would rise up in rebellion was as shocking to many Americans of 1776 as it would be today.
That changed after January 1776, when a man named Thomas Paine published a slim pamphlet called Common Sense. In plain, powerful language, Paine explained how the colonists would be better off without England. Suddenly, the pamphlet was everywhere, and its impact was enormous.
It opens the debate over independence among the people. And you see it in the newspapers, you see it in the towns, you see it in the coffee houses. Suddenly it's legitimate to talk about this no issue. The reports come back to Congress over and over again that people are convinced that the time might well have come for independence.
In April, John Page in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's old college friend and a future governor of Virginia, wrote his friend in Philadelphia and said, "For God's sake, declare the colonies independent."
It would not be Thomas Jefferson, the quiet 33-year-old delegate from Virginia, who would do it, but a fellow Virginian, a delegate named Richard Henry Lee. In June of 1776, Lee presented this resolution to Congress: resolve that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. It was a contentious issue from the start. Delegates took sides, and they wouldn't budge. What is the reason, Mr. Adams, that you New England men oppose our measures of reconciliation? Yelled Pennsylvania's John Dickinson. It is said that such a declaration will arouse and unite Great Britain, wrote John Adams. But are they not already aroused and united as much as they will be?
Some colonies were much in advance of others. Massachusetts, Virginia, for instance, both had been leaders of the opposition right along, and they were well out in front of most of the other colonies who had to catch up. Places like Pennsylvania and New York were much more resistant to the idea of independence.
But it was important to form a united front, so the vote was put off for 3 weeks in the hope that time would sway the reluctant colonies to favor independence. In the meantime, Congress wanted to be prepared. So on June 11th, a committee of 5 was chosen to draft the document that would explain to the world why the colonies were breaking away from Britain. There was Roger Sherman from Connecticut and Robert Livingston from New York, Pennsylvania's Benjamin Franklin, and the outspoken John Adams from Massachusetts, and from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. The committee met to decide who would draft the Declaration. Sherman and Livingston had little experience with the written word. Franklin was ill. That left Adams and Jefferson. As the story goes, Adams declined to be the author for 3 reasons. Reason first, he said to Jefferson, "You are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear head of this business." Reason second, "I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise." Reason third, "You can write 10 times better than I can." And so it was decided. With an outline of instructions from the committee, Jefferson sat down to draft the Declaration of Independence. He would have only 2 weeks to complete his work. It was in this room, as the popular story goes, that Thomas Jefferson sat for days writing the Declaration of Independence. It's a romantic image, groundbreaking ideas about freedom and equality, pouring spontaneously from a great man's pen, the foundations for a new country created by one mastermind. But the reality is quite different. The ideas Jefferson expressed in his writing not only weren't new, they weren't even all his.
What he had to do was capture the kind of general political context that had been developing within the colonies for a long time, so that people would read it and say, "Oh, right, Oh, absolutely. This is how we feel. And for it to be effective in that sense, Jefferson had to be a popularizer of generally held sentiments rather than an innovator, rather than someone who introduced new ideas to the people.
So as Jefferson sat down at his writing desk, he quite literally borrowed ideas and words from other documents of the day. At least one of them was his own previous work, a draft of the Virginia Constitution written earlier that year.
That draft included a set of charges against George III, and when it came time to write the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson used, in essence, the same charges that were in that draft, simply put them in different order and reworded them very slightly.
And there are amazing similarities to a number of other works that Jefferson did not create, like the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason just a month earlier.
The language is very close to Jefferson's. Where Jefferson said, for example, all men are created equal, Mason said all men are born equally free and independent.
Today it smacks of plagiarism, but in 1776 it was not only commonplace, but expected.
It was entirely in keeping with 18th century doctrines of imitation, in which one that was creating an artistic work, whether it be a piece of prose or whether it be a piece of music or whether it be something in architecture, would quite normally turn to established models and draw from those models what he or she could draw and adapt them to existing circumstances.
Jefferson's draft of the Declaration was more than just other people's ideas cut and pasted together. He brought to it a unique style and an almost poetic gift for the written word.
Like most great writers, Jefferson wrote not just for the eye, but he also wrote for the ear. And so if you look at the Declaration of Independence very closely, you find that there is a kind of cadence and a kind of rhythm to it.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,
that they are endowed by their Creator
with certain unalienable rights, that
among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Jefferson's draft said more than that. First, it claimed that if a government was tyrannical, the people had a right to overthrow that government. Next, it included a long list of ways the king had oppressed the colonists. And finally, it concluded that because of the king's oppressive acts, the colonies had the right to declare themselves free and independent states. By June 28th, a draft of the Declaration was finished, but Congress still hadn't voted for independence. So, on July 1st, it once again began debating the issue. South Carolina and Pennsylvania were opposed. Delaware was split. The vote was put off until the next day, when every state approved except New York, which added its consent a week later. The Second Continental Congress had voted to declare independence from Great Britain. In his excitement, John Adams suggested that July 2nd should be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival, with pomp and parade, shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other from this day forward. He had the right idea, but the wrong day. Congress had agreed to declare independence, but they had not agreed on Jefferson's draft of the Declaration. So for 2 days, Congress debated Jefferson's draft, making numerous changes to the text. An entire passage that blamed King George III for the slave trade was eliminated. Jefferson later claimed it was removed at the urging of South Carolina and Georgia. But there may have been more to it than that.
I think the problem with the passage was that it was too long, it was overwritten, it made an argument which on the face of it was untenable, that is, blaming the king for the slave trade and making the colonists look innocent. And it also attracted attention to the fact that the slave trade was persisting and that the colonists still had slaves. There was a big contradiction involved with asserting that all men are created equal while holding slaves, and it was probably better not to attract attention to the contradiction.
Some of the other changes were minor. Congress added a word here, deleted a word there. Inherent and inalienable rights was changed to certain inalienable rights, which only later became unalienable rights. The phrase neglected utterly was reversed to utterly neglected. Often it made Jefferson's charges less harsh. What Jefferson called the king's unremitting injuries became, for example, his repeated injuries. Jefferson's rough draft, complete with all its changes, is part of the collection at the Library of Congress. It's housed in a state-of-the-art stainless steel container, protected from ultraviolet light and surrounded by inert argon gas.
And what you see as you look at this is the 16 changes that were made by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, the 31 changes that were made by the Committee of Five before it was sent to Congress, and then the 39 additional changes that Congress made in the document itself. Some of these involve the addition or removal of entire paragraphs. You can see that there's a flap that was actually pasted in by Jefferson because during the course of the committee's editing of the document, they added 3 entire paragraphs. So Jefferson, in the way of all writers, resorted to cut and paste and wrote out the paragraph once again on a separate sheet of paper and then simply pasted it on top.
This was no hack editing job. Somebody in that Congress had a wonderful eye for language, maybe several delegates, and they did a beautiful job of editing it.
On July 4th, 1776, Congress finally approved the Declaration of Independence, but there was no shouting, no fireworks, no celebrations. The delegates left Independence Hall knowing that they were risking not only the future of their country, but their fortunes and their lives. Benjamin Harrison of Virginia said to Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, "I shall have a great advantage over you when we are all hung for what we are now doing, Mr. Gerry. From the size and weight of my body, I shall die in a few minutes. But from the lightness of your body, you will dance in the air for an hour or two before you are dead." The American Revolution had begun. In a matter of months, the Continental Congress had evolved from a group of men determined to coexist with England into a room full of revolutionaries. It was risky, uncharted territory. The philosophical notions of freedom and self-rule were suddenly thrust into the foundations for a new republic. The colonists truly were about to go where no one had gone before.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
The news of independence hit Philadelphia first, and when it did, bells rang all day and almost all night. The Declaration of Independence was read aloud in town squares throughout the colonies, and by the end of July, it had appeared in at least 30 newspapers. There was excitement in the air, but fear of the unknown loomed over the celebrations.
These are serious statements about a state of political emergency that is going to change your life forever. And people understood that when they heard the Declaration read.
Especially on the front lines where the fighting had already begun. In New York, the Declaration was read to George Washington's troops, and a young recruit recorded the soldiers' reaction in his diary.
July 9th, he notes that a group of soldiers had taken down a statue of King George III, severed its head, and wheeled it in a wheelbarrow to General Washington.
Indeed, in one place after another, you have crowds go out and rip down the royal arms from courthouses or from taverns.
In New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore, all signs of British royalty were destroyed. The flurry of excitement was followed by 5 years of bloody fighting. The war would finally end with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. By the time it was over, the Declaration of Independence was all but forgotten. It wasn't until nationalism surged after the War of 1812 that many people became interested again in the document. A new generation had come into power, one that felt great sadness as members of the revolutionary generation began dying off. There was renewed interest in the memories and records of that earlier time. So, beginning in 1818, copies of the Declaration of Independence, known now as facsimiles, started to appear. The New York Public Library has a collection of almost 50 facsimiles. Some were produced in the late 1800s as America neared its 100th birthday. It was around that time that the copies started taking on a new and somewhat surprising use.
Many people printed facsimiles of the Declaration to advertise their products. So you could get a declaration which advertised pills. You could get a declaration that advertised insurance. Some of these advertisers would actually put their text right in the middle of the Declaration.
Suddenly, the Declaration of Independence was everywhere, and the more people read the words, the more the meaning of the document began to change.
I'd always thought of the Declaration as, well, as a statement of separation from England.
Oh, but it's so much more than that.
In 1776, the Declaration's purpose was to justify the colony's separation from Great Britain. But by the early 1800s, people were finding a deeper meaning in the words. It seemed to be spelled out in the opening paragraphs, claims that all men are created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Whenever any group decided that it had been excluded and ought not to be excluded, they've appealed to that clause in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. And so when in 1848 the women's movement decided that it was unfair to exclude half the population from political participation, they specifically modeled their declaration after the Declaration of Independence.
Abraham Lincoln did it too during the Civil War, but he took it a step farther, reinterpreting the reason the words were in the Declaration in the first place.
They were put there, Lincoln said, for future generations to provide a bulwark against tyranny in American society. Well, he's absolutely wrong, historically, but he made a very powerful case, and it's a good example of the way we have reconstructed the Declaration to fit the needs of the moment and of subsequent generations throughout American history.
Martin Luther King used it in his "I Have a Dream" speech, and Ho Chi Minh in writing a Declaration of Independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The delegates to the Second Continental Congress would have been amazed.
When Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," he was not literally referring to human equality as we would understand it in the 20th century.
Since that time, the words of the Declaration have been open to interpretation by anyone who feels mistreated by those in power.
Look at the language of the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There are no qualifications upon those words, and they can be extended to broaden the lines of power and privilege in almost any direction.
And so each year on the 4th of July, we celebrate not simply the independence of our country, but the Declaration of Independence as a document that protects the rights and principles that we as a people hold dear.
That wasn't the meaning of the Declaration in its beginning. It's what later generations made of it. It's an achievement of the American people over time, not a gift of the Founding Fathers.
56 men signed the Declaration of Independence, but only 3 would live to see it become one of the most revered documents in the country. By the mid-1820s, only Charles Carroll, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams were still living. But on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, perhaps the most extraordinary coincidence in American history would take place. It was on that day that both Jefferson and Adams died, one in Virginia, the other 600 miles away in Massachusetts.
Adams, as he closed his eyes, was heard to mumble by one of his family, a daughter-in-law, something that she couldn't quite make out. But she thought he said, "Thomas Jefferson survives." And so these go down as Adams's last words, not knowing that at 1 o'clock in Virginia, Jefferson had closed his eyes for the last time.
The fact that the last 2 members of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence should die simultaneously, one saying the Republic is still safe because the other is alive, while in fact the other was dying, it's just awesome, just awesome.
On almost every day of the year, you can find people visiting the National Archives to see the Declaration of Independence. There's only one problem. The words are so faded it's nearly impossible to read, and a protective light filter makes it look, well, green.
Some things have happened in the past that we can't undo. It's very difficult to read. It's fairly difficult to read even without the filter in front of it, but we're aware of that. At this point, it's an icon and revered for just what it stands for, but if you want to read the text, that's not going to be very easy to do.
So why does it look so bad? Well, for 35 years, the Declaration was hung in front of a window here at the Patent Office. Few people realized how damaging sunlight could be, and by the mid-1800s, the document had deteriorated badly. One visitor to the Patent Office referred to it as that old-looking paper with the fading ink. He was almost right. It was faded, but it wasn't paper. The Declaration of Independence was written on animal skin, commonly known as parchment.
The reason this is wrinkled is because parchment is very sensitive to water. It absorbs moisture and will expand, and as it dries out, it starts to contract. The ink sits on the surface of the parchment and is likely to be very sensitive and friable and would tend to expand and contract and flake off.
Changes in the humidity also caused the document to become brittle and crack, and in the early 1900s, the method of correcting such a problem wasn't very sophisticated.
We go for Scotch brand, the best tape is Scotch brand.
The Declaration of Independence was mended with what we know of as pressure-sensitive tape, a Scotch tape. Scotch is just a brand name, but pressure-sensitive tape is what conservators call it.
Along with the original Constitution of the United States, another document, precious to the hearts of all the nation's citizens, is being preserved for posterity. The Declaration.
It wasn't until 1951 that the first modern preservation efforts began. The Declaration of Independence was sealed in glass, and the damaging oxygen was replaced with humidified helium. A filter was added to screen out harmful light. But no one could be sure if the conservation efforts were really working. So in 1987, the National Archives installed the Charters Monitoring Room, a $3 million computerized camera system designed using technology from the Hubble Space Telescope.
We started baseline images in 1987, and we've been taking images every year and comparing the differences from year to year.
The sensitive camera can detect fading or flaking of the ink. It can tell if the document has expanded or changed size, and it can even monitor the condition of the glass that sits on top of the Declaration.
We found that the inside surfaces of the glass have started to crizzle and form crystals.
And you can see a lot of these features here. That's glass deterioration.
Here in the second part of the monitoring room, a computer stores the images recorded by the camera.
We're looking at, this is the C and the O in Congress at the top of the Declaration where it says in Congress. And these white lines are more of the crizzling, the glass deterioration. This is 76 at the top of the Declaration, 1776. You can see in 76 here, the ink has flaked off in the past.
These images have helped the scientists at the National Archives develop a preservation plan for the new millennium.
We are here to announce the protective re-encasement of the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. This morning, we'll unveil a state-of-the-art manufacturing model for the new encasements.
The new encasements will be made from commercially pure titanium, filled with inert argon gas and maintained at approximately 67 degrees and 45% relative humidity.
The reopening will come in the year 2003 with the charters safely re-encased on public view in a chamber that itself will be restored and made even more accessible.
When the work is finally done, millions of people will once again visit the National Archives, hoping for a fleeting glimpse of America's past.
It's the one American political document that you can always count on people knowing about, caring about, being interested in. It is, in essence, the linguistic representation of the promise of American life in the same way, for example, the Statue of Liberty is a structural representation of the promise of American life.
But the Declaration of Independence wasn't written to promise equality or happiness. In fact, it wasn't written to promise anything at all. It was written to justify America's separation from Great Britain. That's it. The American people have made it everything it is today.
This is a man-made document. Nobody has any real illusion that the document was given to the American people as Moses gave the Jewish people the Ten Commandments. It isn't a gift of God. It's a creation of men, of the Second Continental Congress. Its modern meaning is a creation of what the American people have made of it over 2 centuries of American history. It's our creation.
And so we find ourselves trying to live up to the ideals that we have created. We have tried, and we are still trying, but we have yet to fully realize our goals.
We are suffering from our prejudices today just as they did those many years ago. But the Declaration offers us language of passion and purpose and commitment that could help us sustain our belief, our hope that we can do better, that we can be better than we are.
In 1952, President Harry Truman stood in front of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. He said, "We venerate these documents not because they're old, not because they're valuable historical relics, but because they still have meaning for us." For the History Channel, I'm Harry Smith. Thanks for watching.